Let me first take the opportunity to welcome everyone to today's session. My name is Frida Yawson. I am the Senior Manager for Infrastructure and Innovation at the African Center for Economic Transformation. And I'm really excited to welcome all of you to today's session on African and European collaboration and safeguarding an open and free internet. So, I think many of us are aware that this is an important topic for discussion in today's increasingly digital and global economy. As both the World Bank and UNCTAD have noted, the current digital economy landscape is characterized by stark imbalances and inequalities between countries leading in digital development and those lagging behind. The principles of openness, permissionless innovation, and resilience upon which the internet was founded are increasingly faltering. Increasing restrictions on freedoms, regulatory and technical fragmentation, and a new era of geopolitical competition have left the open internet on the brink. So the international community really stands at a crossroads to determine whether the internet and the global digital economy will become inclusive, fair, and sustainable, allowing for equal development chances for all of us. From the African perspective, some countries have taken advantage of rapid increases in internet penetration to make concrete improvements in the lives of citizens. Despite a low internet penetration, Africa has leapt up ahead of other regions to become a center for mobile peer-to-peer finance, registering nearly half of the 1.2 million mobile money accounts worldwide. It's estimated that by 2025, the internet economy can contribute 180 billion to Africa's economy. Yet, social gaps in the use of digital services and spatial inequalities in digital infrastructure are limiting this potential. On the EU side, the EU promotes a regulatory, people-centered approach and combines this with a market-based model that emphasizes the protection of individual data and privacy. But it's yet to be seen whether this approach can compete with the offerings of other players, let's be honest, like US and China, who have also expanded their activities and investments in digital development in the global south. As we know, in the 6th EU-AU summit in February, they addressed both the immediate opportunities and challenges for the partnership, including a 150 billion investment package. So that's incredible. But we know that even with investment, the digital divide goes beyond the gaps in infrastructure and internet access. More and more, it needs to be understood in terms of countries' capacities to shape their own digital development, to guard their own digital sovereignty, and to influence international governance and rule setting in their own favor. So, in the next 40 minutes, our wonderful panel of experts is going to explore how EU and AU stakeholders can jointly support and promote an open and free internet. Now, just a few housekeeping items before we jump into our panel. I just wanted everyone to know that we will be using the chat section to monitor your questions. There will be a Q&A session after the panel. So please utilize the chat to send us any questions you have, any comments you have. It will be aggregated at the end of the panel discussion for our panelists. So it is my pleasure to introduce our distinguished panelists for today. I'm just going by alphabetical order. Let's start with Karishma. Karishma Banga is an economist at the Institute for Development Studies. Her focus is on international trade, digitalization, and development. And she works as a research fellow in the Digital and Technology Cluster. And some of her work examines upgrading global value chains, digitalization, and labor markets and digital trade negotiations, particularly for African and Asian economies. So welcome, Karishma. Just give everyone a wave. Next, we have Jan Hofmeier, who is the head of research and policy at the Institute for Justice and Reconciliation. So Jan is a socio-political analyst specializing in the exploration of emerging and megatrends in sub-Saharan Africa. He heads the research and policy department at IJR, which is one of Africa's leading think tanks in the field of transitional justice and peace building. He also serves as a senior advisory group on the senior advisory group for Afrobarometer. For those who don't know, that is one of the most cited public opinion research projects on the continent. We also have Christina Mand, who is an e-democracy expert at the Estonian e-governance academy. So Christina is works with civil society and public sector organizations to navigate the digital world and really increase digital literacy. She helps leaders and organizations understand the value of digital engagement and use digital methods and tools for good governance responsibly. Finally, we have Chloe Thuven. Chloe is the head of digital economy and governance at ECDPM, that's the European Center for Development Policy Management. Her interests are focused on the EU-AU digital partnership, digital governance, and the geopolitics of development. She's also a non-resident scholar with the North African Sahel Program in the Middle East Institute in DC. And she's also worked with the European Council for Foreign Relations, amongst other consultancies in North Africa. So today we have an amazing, amazing panel. Welcome, everybody. We're excited to have you here. So I've talked enough. Let's start today's discussion. And Karishma, I want to start with you as we explore, first of all, the context and some of the challenges that we face in achieving an open and free internet. So can you tell us a little bit about the differences that European and Africa stakeholders face in terms of the challenges and opportunities in the digital sector, especially in terms of achieving an open and free internet?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Freda, for the introductory remarks, and thanks everyone for joining in. I think, Frida, you already touched upon two key points that I wanted to focus my intervention around, which is looking at issues of access and looking at the fragmented regulatory frameworks that you were mentioning. So I think particularly in the post-COVID context, digital trade and internet as a whole has emerged again with increasing spotlight as a sort of mitigating pathway for the economic effects of COVID-19. And we see that there has been a huge spike in terms of overall internet traffic globally, as well as greater adoption of social media, of e-commerce and digital trade in general. But I think it's very important to understand that the models of access of internet and more broadly digital trade, as well as use, differ quite significantly across the two continents. So for example, 35 out of every 100 Europeans have access to fixed broadband subscriptions, which came up, of course, as the primary channel of accessing the internet during the COVID-19. But this is just less than 2 people on the sub-Saharan African region. And even the pandemic-induced internet surge that we saw across different countries, that came at the cost of declining broadband speeds in several African countries, where broadband speeds declined by actually 20%. So we saw that the coverage of internet expanded, but this came at the cost of the speed of internet. The second point I wanted to raise was around looking at issues of the different models that we're seeing now of how the internet is being used, specifically around digital trade. So a lot of the work that I've done around e-commerce in Kenya and Rwanda, for instance, points to the fact that e-commerce tends to be, in majority of the firms, tends to be through their own e-commerce enabled websites rather than third-party cross-border platforms like Jumia. Or else it tends to be a lot more informal through social media websites like Facebook or WhatsApp. So e-commerce continues to be very situational and fragmented, and particularly for women MSMEs who tend to enter these spaces more through mobiles rather than fixed broadband access. And the third point is around looking at the fact that the ICT regulatory frameworks, differ a lot across Europe and Africa. And we know that, of course, EU has a very pioneering data protection legislation. And I don't think the problem is necessarily the lack of awareness of data protection and privacy regulations in Africa, because there are around 32 African countries that do have a data protection legislation. It's more to do, I think, with the enforcement of these regulations. So for instance, 15 of the 32 African countries that I was mentioning, they actually don't have a data protection agency. And even when they do have a data protection agency, there are lots of disparities emerging regarding the enforcement of data protection, where some African countries like Ghana and Mauritius are doing far better than others like Nigeria, which don't even have the requirement to notify when there is a data protection breach in their laws. So I think these issues are quite different across the two contexts that we're talking about. And just last point, around the fact that around the regulatory framework, I think there's also an important need in Africa to kind of bridge this discussion around macro level data localization policies and developments, and looking at the development of the local digital and data industry in Africa. So we know that Africa accounts for less than 1% of the global data center capacity, and a large amount of content, IT content, is actually being consumed from abroad in Africa. So there is a lot of space there for targeted investments as well around building those sort of data processing capabilities on the continent to be able to leverage digital intelligence and to gain competitive advantage, as we've seen happening in the case of Europe. So I think I'll just end there, but these are my three broad points that I'm happy to touch upon later as well.
Thank you so much, Karishma. I think you laid out very clearly some of the challenges that we face from access, to fragmented, websites and data protection issues that I think are an interesting challenges that we need to overcome. But it's also interesting, also, as you've mentioned these, is to think about even how our governments visualize or perceive the need for an open and free internet. So let me come to Katrina. Christina, I'm sorry. From an Estonian perspective, I'm curious to know how do EU governments define the priority of an open and free internet, say, as opposed to African governments, for instance? Could you shed some light on that?
Sure. I think one of the key things in our case is also to think of open internet as a human right issue. I was just sharing it with my younger family members the other day that 30, 40 years ago, we didn't even know that such thing exists or even could exist, and now we take it for granted. So the way it works in Europe is that we really, over those years, have believed that all people should have and get the most out of digital transformation. And internet is one of those tools. In order to regulate that, there exists EU's regulation on open internet, which talks about the access and distribution of and the right to access and distribute lawful content and services that people might need, and also the sort of non-discriminating traffic management. But what has happened over the recent years, and especially in my own home country, Estonia, is that digital should be at the service of inclusive, prosperous, and sustainable society. So in order that to work, we need to put the users in the center, which means that people are at the center. And I think that's sort of the underlying notion of how things are in Europe and what the governments are pursuing. Every country perhaps slightly different or with a slightly different speed. Estonia is a very highly digitalized country. Some countries are less but then at the same time, in some services or some developments or political engagement, they are making more progress, but we are all sort of on the same level, more or less. But when we say that we want to put people at the center, what we essentially mean is that in addition to this right to access to internet, we also talk about secure online space. We talk about the right to learn digital skills. It's almost like it's a human right question. We talk about algorithms that respect people. So instead of sort of authoritarian algorithmic authoritarianism, if you want to call it this way, they should be at the service of how people use internet and what internet can do and access to internet can do for the benefit of the society, or for the benefit of the development of the society. We talk about the protection of children. We talk about the legal rights and protection of personal data and freedom. And most of all, we talk about openness. And I'll come back to some of those points in a few seconds, but in that line, the European governments and the European Commission are in the process of establishing a European Declaration on Digital Rights and Principles for the digital decade that we're currently living in. So I already mentioned some of those principles of free internet that we honor in Europe and want to pursue in Europe, and in Estonia, I would also add here some of those discussions that I'm going on here. And what I really appreciate, in addition to the sort of evident cybersecurity question, data protection, access, all that, is really, for example, the right to share in the rich cultural experience offered by the internet. What is free? What should be also the right for the people, or, for example, the right to freedom of thought and speech on the internet. We already talked about the protection of data and personal details stored on the internet. But for example, also something that might be a bit harder to measure, but something like dignity on the internet without fearing cyberbullying or identity theft. We also talked about access to services, to digitalized services. In many countries, most of the services are being digitalized. So whenever we are designing a service or redesigning a service, particularly public service, of course, it's immediately being designed the way that it's also digitally accessible. So that's the thing that we talk. And then there's the question of responsibility and whose task it is to promote openness and freedom to internet. So let's talk about that a bit later.
Thank you, Christina. I think those are really all very important questions. And, you know, I think from the African perspective, I know that the AU has a strategy in place that also echoes some of these same sentiments. The interesting question is whether or not what that really looks like on the ground, right? Governments are facing a number of issues around not just access, but their whole COVID-19 implications on their economy, and whether or not they can actually prioritize open and safe internet is a realistic question. So if there are any African stakeholders in our participants, I would encourage you to tell us a little bit in the chat whether or not you feel your governments really prioritize open and safe internet. It would be interesting to hear from you, your perspective in your home countries as well, and also our European stakeholders. Please feel free to share. We'll come back and look at that later. So speaking of that and the European approach, let me come to Chloe. Chloe, I know that the Team Europe approach is a significant change. It's a change, but I want to know how significant of a change it is, and how the EU and its member states jointly work with partner countries in promoting an open and free internet. Do you see some changes in this new approach?
Thank you, Frida. Well, the Team Europe approach really came about in the context of this increasingly geopolitical framing of development policy in general. And so it's not only with regard to digital policy, but really in the EU's development policy more broadly, that this Team Europe approach is looking to bring together, of course, the EU institutions, the EU member states, the development banks, as well as private sector actors, and one would hope also civil society and researchers like ourselves. But it definitely is positive to see the EU member states and the institutions coordinating and coming together around a shared approach. And this is something that there have been many efforts in the past to do this, and also to create more of a European brand rather than having multiple fragmented, having EU projects, having French projects, having Estonian projects, for example, that all of these would come together under one banner. This also avoids duplicating efforts. So this is very much a positive, and we're seeing that in many countries around the world that this has led to much better coordination. And through the D4D hub, there is a huge amount of coordination happening around the digital for development portfolio. But one thing that has got to be kept in mind is that it's always that we need to be centering the end user, and coordinating amongst ourselves as Europeans is not the end goal. And there have been some concerns that we may end up spending too much time coordinating amongst EU institutions and EU member states, and not actually focusing on what are the needs from partner countries and from the stakeholders on the ground. So the important thing with the Team Europe approach going forward will be to turn it into a Team Europe plus Africa approach in Africa, whereby African stakeholders are really part of the conversation from the get-go, and that the needs of the end users when it comes to digital or any other policy area are really centered. Thanks.
Thank you, Chloe. I think perhaps continentally, our African colleagues would also agree that similarly, it's difficult to sort of harmonize and get all the different states together and under one approach. So it's a great first step in doing so. So I want to now come to Jan around a topic that perhaps is a little contentious or sensitive. I think, as we all know, there are a number of competing approaches, and with actors like the US, China, and others engaging various stakeholders on the African continent. What do you think the main geopolitical challenges facing the African EU relations are in the digital sector?
Yes, thank you, Frida. Contentious indeed, but I think geopolitics at the moment is so topical, as we see sort of massive shifts occurring in weeks, which we haven't seen in years. So I think it is definitely an interesting discussion, and maybe something that in the long term also impacts on the topic that we talk about today. But maybe just to restate what you also said in your introduction, is that the digital revolution really holds the potential for leapfrogging to put Africa on an elevated developmental trajectory. But as we know, I think the most obvious impediment is infrastructure. So the race is really on for finding the finance to put that infrastructure in place. And for Africa, the challenge would be to do this in a way that does not create new dependencies amounting to what some would call a new form of colonialism. I think for the EU, the challenge would be to prove that its model can do just that, what it promises, namely providing support to human-centered approaches for the creation of trustworthy digital technologies that is enabling of African economic potential and innovation on African terms and driven by African requirements. And so this is a normative approach that is distinctly geopolitical, whereas the EU's main competitors in Africa, namely China and the US, has up to now been more geo-economic in their approach with geopolitical implications. And for these two countries, large tech giants have up to now done the sovereign's bidding for influence through competition for infrastructure. And because of its smaller tech sector, the US as a bloc, the EU as a bloc has not really been able to compete in this domain. And at this point in time, it competes more for influence on the basis of shared principles and values underpinned by an enabling regulatory environment or creation of the regulatory environment. So one of the cornerstones or values that the EU prioritizes is the concept of digital sovereignty. And it's a concept that also really finds resonance in Africa, given its history of colonialism and dependence. So the challenge that I foresee, and it's the one that I would really like to highlight here, is to find consensus about what exactly that sovereignty entails. The European model pursues digital sovereignty, as Christina also pointed out, as a principle to protect the self-determination of individuals and societies to shape their respective digital environments. The Chinese model, in turn, also prioritizes digital sovereignty, but interprets it from a state-centered perspective, arguing that states should have self-determination in how their governments regulate the digital sphere, which then also allows for the kind of techno-authoritarianism that is practiced in China. So how we view this sovereignty, which both the EU and Africa agrees upon, partly determines on values and political culture, but may also be influenced by other factors that are independent of the normative orientation of the state. So one of these may be the extent of trust and legitimacy that exist in societies, especially trust and legitimacy of the state. If it's weak, it may be inclined towards a state-centered approach that uses technology to control rather to enable. And in instances where trust and cohesion is strong, it may be bolder in interpreting sovereignty in a human-centered way that creates citizen agency. So I would venture to say that under the current circumstances in Africa of weak growth, amid the pandemic, which also exerts material pressure on citizens, social cohesion has weakened, and therefore the prospect of political instability may make some states more inclined towards an interpretation that favors state control. Maybe also coming back then to my first point, and it's more speculation than anything else at this point, is that in the past month, amid the invasion of Ukraine, we've seen a rapid reshaping of global politics, and amongst other things, it could also accelerate a growing ideological polarization between democratic and authoritarian states. And this may also accelerate the bifurcation of the internet in parallel digital domains, one dominated by the West and another by authoritarian states led by China. And this could force choices of allegiance on African states, not necessarily informed by values, but by existing infrastructure and related financial dependencies. And so I think to preempt this, Europe would also have to start considering in the long term how it would create this collaborative environment in supporting and also lessen such dependency, not necessarily only through norms, but also over time through the provision of infrastructure. I think I'll stop there for now.
Thank you, Jan. I think those are really important points, especially from an African perspective, the issue of potential data colonialism, reminiscent of a whole Cold War situation, as we are in this increasingly crazy situation. And so I think it's very important that some of these things, as difficult as they are to discuss, are in the back of our minds as we pursue, these principles of the open internet. And actually, this brings me to my next question. And Chloe, this is for you. So with this in mind, and considering the partnership, considering everything that's at stake, how do you think that the EU can support Africa's vision for a free and open internet? At the same time, balancing and perhaps, knowing that it wants to promote this human-centric vision for digital sovereignty. How does EU sort of balance this need to support, but at the same time champion what it believes is right in a human-centric approach?
Well, I think there's 3 points that I'd like to touch on here. The first is really around process. The second is around infrastructure and skills. And the third is on research and analysis. So as Jan just touched on, there is, I think that the idea of data sovereignty or digital sovereignty very much appeals both to Europeans and to Africans, but that what digital sovereignty actually means is very different to different actors. And coming to a shared understanding would require a process whereby we really sit down together and really move towards a joint vision. And sometimes I fear that we tend to, because we have been speaking amongst ourselves as Europeans a lot, and we have a clear idea in some cases of exactly what we have in mind. There tends to already be a very strong idea of what the Europeans want to promote externally. So it's extremely important that when we sit down together, that we are actually open to discussing new ideas and to certainly ensuring that we are pursuing a human-centric approach and that digital rights are protected as part of this approach, but that we are also centering the perspectives of African civil society, of African governments. And I think that multiple people today have mentioned the PRIDA, the Policy and Regulation Initiative for Digital Africa, which is an AU-EU ITU initiative. And there, I think that there was a process in terms of bringing African regulators together and then bringing European regulators in an advisory capacity, but in one that was very much respectful of, the differences in terms of the African environment, that was quite successful. And so the process is extremely important when it comes to these questions. Again, today we've talked an awful lot about infrastructure and skills, and these topics keep coming up again and again. So that would be my second point, is that when we talk about digital governance, that is not independent of the wider environment, and we do need to invest in in infrastructure that will support the regulatory frameworks that we are helping to put in place. So if you talk about data governance, it is also important to think about the cybersecurity environment, the infrastructure to ensure that there is, that data is safe and secure, as well as ensuring that you have the personnel to put in place these regulations. As Karishma mentioned earlier, in many African countries, you have a data protection law, but you don't necessarily have an agency that is actually able to follow up on these laws. So working with African governments to ensure that there are personnel in place and in order to follow up on these kinds of regulations is vital. And thirdly, I would say that that there is a need to really invest in much more research in this area, particularly in Africa, to ensure that we have a research community that is vibrant, that there are academics as well as think tanks across Europe and particularly in Africa who are doing ground research that will feed into these discussions and that will feed into a better understanding of what in specific African countries is the geopolitical context, in order to understand, how do you promote a free and open internet that is built on the basis of the local context and local concerns. Thank you.
Thank you, Chloe. That's a great summary. So we need to keep in mind the process, right? Working together in a shared way, not forgetting the wider context, and also promoting research that allows us to really understand each other in the context. So with that in mind, Jan, I'm going to come back to you. And I think you've touched on this in a way, but I just want to deep dive a little bit on Chloe's point on the context. So we just talked about the EU model, the Team Europe approach. Now, from a South African perspective, do you think that given the disparities of perspective and of size of different African economies, that such a model can work on the continent?
Thanks for that question, Frida. Yes, I think exactly for those reasons, we should follow a team approach. As a South African, I'm a sports fanatic, and I'm particularly sort of a rugby fanatic, and I'm really interested also in team dynamics. And if one just looks sort of at the Team Europe model, from or through that lens, one knows that team members have different functions based on their particular competitive strengths, and they are so good teams are those that are capable of crafting strategy that allows them to make the best possible use of different competencies in the team. So it does not rely on individual brilliance of particular countries, neither does it require a brilliant team of players. It really depends on how you combine what you have in order to achieve the goals. In other words, strategy. And I think, although also still in its infancy, this has made the Team Europe approach up to now a strong one. And like any team, they don't play brilliantly from the first game. They also need to play together for a while to develop the intuition for the styles of the different team members, what each can contribute. And I believe that the same can be done in Africa, exactly because of its diversity, the talent that we have, and the size that we require for a team approach. What would be needed is an overarching strategy towards the achievement of goals. At the outset, there may be growing pains and bottlenecks, I think, as Team Europe has also experienced, and that's par for the course. The more the strategy is applied, the more trained and the more intuitive the different role players become about their systemic interactions and how they can leverage it to the advantage within the context that we work.
That's a brilliant analogy. I'm not a rugby player, but I am a football fanatic, and I very much echo that sentiment. I think one of the challenges the African continent, and not just African continent, but others have faced is, getting all the players together to actually agree on a strategy, and then once we agree on a strategy, to actually work together to implement it. So with that in mind, I'm going to come to Karishma and then Christina. There are a number of different stakeholders that are involved in this process, from private sector to academia to NGOs to governments themselves, that are required to work together in promoting an open internet. So first, Karishma, to you, what role do you think academia can play in supporting an open internet?
Yeah, thank you. Thanks, Frida, for the question. I think just touching upon what was, being talked about, looking at the wider context, so just going beyond the EU-AU cooperation, we know that the digital agenda has been largely pushed forward, by certain big tech firms. And recent analysis has shown that, ICT lobbying, for instance, reached about $80 million in 2020. And if you look at firms like Facebook or Amazon, the ICT lobbying by these firms has, almost doubled in just the last 5 years. So clearly we see that there is a certain sort of agenda, setting in place. And since there has not been any consensus at the sort of multilateral level, this is largely being pushed forward through bilateral trade agreements or preferential trade agreements. So I think it's also very important to understand the norm setting in these agreements, and how digital trade provisions are being factored into those, and the development implications of that for African countries signing these agreements. So I think that is one space where academics and more broadly research is very important to understand. The second, I think, is around looking at this aspect that, there has been a lot of investments in digital infrastructure in Africa, but there is still a lot more that needs to be done. And the investment needs to be a lot more targeted into specific sectors. And this will need, very informed and careful analysis of policy and regulatory readiness for technology sustainability and for inclusive engagement across, gender, across MSMEs. And here I think, certain sector-based analysis can be very useful in understanding how different aspects like access, adoption of technologies, affordability of data, skills and infrastructure are coming into play to shape the formation of an open internet in Africa. So that's the second point where I think academics and research more broadly has a role to play. And lastly, I think, and I think quite importantly, even issues such as data sovereignty and digital sovereignty are not really happening in silos. And I think they need to fit into this broader discussion on digital industrialization in Africa. So which of the models are actually working for African countries to develop their own local domestic digital industry, to create job opportunities using that, and to gain competitive advantage, right? Using data as an asset. And I think here it's very important to understand how e-commerce rules or data governance rules are interacting more broadly with issues around digital taxation, digital monopolization by certain firms, online consumer protection rules, and so on. And I think, so just to give you an example, for instance, we know that algorithmic decision-making is on the rise. And there is evidence showing that, this is creating new biases for women sellers on e-commerce platforms. So it's very important, I think, to understand how these interactions are taking place and to understand the development implications for African countries and across different segments of population within Africa. So I think that's the third point where academia could potentially play a very important role. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Karishma. Yes, there's a lot to explore, given what you've mentioned here, and I think that that gives us a lot of room for potential collaboration, I think, even after these panel sessions, which is exactly what this hub is here to do. So I think that those are great opportunities for us going forward. So let me come to you, Christina. You know, eGov Estonia has been supporting the government and others in understanding the need for open and free internet. You've been training. What role do you think NGOs can play on both sides, on both continents, to support this?
Right. I would also say that there are three sort of key things to look at. First is the promotion of digital responsibility. The second is to avoid the creation or further creation of digitally vulnerable groups. And third is to advocate for and nudge for and push for citizen engagement through digital transformation or using digital transformation to foster citizen engagement. So when we think about digital responsibility, we think about people and organizations and governments to have the right and freedom to use sort of all types of digital technology wisely in an acceptable and appropriate manner and respect the work of the others. So there is the CSO's role to look at, or the civil society organization's role, to look at the values and norms of digital responsibility, what either the general guidelines, sort of the moral norms, the ethical norms of how we use internet and how we produce tools and artifacts for internet. On this, then going over to specific norms and ethics that are very business related or more shared values which are explicit and tangible. And this is where we come to the usual culprits of how we like to blame or we like to put the responsibility for the creators of social media platforms and so on. I'm talking about the corporations and businesses. Yes, they have their responsibility and a huge responsibility, and the CSO's role is to look that they either that they follow those generally agreed values and norms of digital responsibility in their areas, in their framework. But then the CSOs also have the third group to work with. These are the users of digital tools and internet, the way we treat what's produced for us, the way we are engaged in producing ourselves information, giving out our data. We as individuals and organizations also have a responsibility to protect ourselves and the others. And sometimes I feel like we want to put a lot of responsibility on corporations and take little as individuals. And I think we should look at that. The second point is the CSO's role in monitoring and keeping an eye and advocating for the prevention of digitally vulnerable groups, that we don't create further people whose access, awareness, or skills are so limited or so small or are so dangerous that they can't enjoy the benefits of digital world. And the third is the citizen engagement, the citizens' right to be part of the decision making that affects their lives. So we talk about civil society here, right? And that's the role of the CSOs, to make sure that they put public pressure and collective public action for the right to have access to internet, for the digital responsibility of the governments and the businesses and their civil society organizations, that they monitor the regulations or the transparency and openness of regulations that affect access to internet, or for example, freedom to develop one's skills, or anything to do with cyber hygiene, cyber security, and data protection. And of course, the civil societies and civil society organizations' role to test, promote, and educate and build skills. So what nonprofits or civil society organizations normally do: advocate, create, and nudge for an enabling environment, working with public sector, also working with businesses as watchdogs, and the third role to build the skills and responsibility of their own stakeholders, of their own members, of their own audiences, to use, contribute to and develop internet and digital processes responsibly. So the way I see it, we're all in this together for this sort of inclusive digital transformation for our society. So that's the role of the civil society organizations.
Thank you, Christina. We have a lot to do, clearly, and I think that is the beauty of the D4D Hub is that all of our different stakeholders can come together and take little pieces of the pie, working together through dialogue, through joint programs, and working towards these one step at a time. So. Thank you so much for your contributions. We have a few more minutes to go. So I want to pause now and go to the audience and see what questions we have today from the audience. I see a lot of people, or at least one person really, Jan, agreeing with you that legitimacy is a really relevant point considering government decisions around internet access. But another question we have is, how do we practically focus on the user needs of human-centered sovereignty? So, as I mentioned before, in some African countries, while this is an important point, right now, we're focusing on getting our economies back up to speed. There are competing priorities. So can we, have some practical examples of how governments can practically focus on the needs of users and a human-centered approach in the middle of everything that they have to tackle? Anyone can tackle this question, panelists. Sure, Christina, please go ahead.
One of the things that I would like to remind us all is that digital shouldn't be a separate issue. It's not a separate agenda. It's a horizontal thing of everything we do. For every policy, for every decision, for every service, for every project, think how digital can serve the purposes of that project. And Freda, when you said that, the governments have other things to tackle with, digital is not another thing. It is part of everything we do. And I think if we change that thinking in our head and start to realize that, then we don't see as this, oh my God, an elephant in the, a huge elephant we don't know what to do with. Just look at it and embrace it and use it see it as an opportunity rather than as a challenge or as a problem. And then comes trust, which is something that Jan also talked about. And that's another super important thing, is to trust ourselves, our organizations, our governments, businesses, and our own sort of internal discipline to use the digital solutions and internet smartly.
That's a great point, Christina. It can be an enabler for everything. It's not something off to the side that we should just go and look at in a silo. That's great. Thank you. Any other thoughts on this particular point? Okay, then let me go to the next question, which is that maybe it looks like a statement, but perhaps we can look at it from a practical perspective. So this is that we are lacking a veritable African-European joint process for digital sovereignty. And I think, Chloe, this touches a little bit on the point you made on the need for a clear process. Could you expand on perhaps what the process is like today in terms of AU-EU relations for digital sovereignty and perhaps opportunities where we can improve the process?
Sure. So I think there are a number of different processes rather than one single process, I would suggest. And as Karishma mentioned, digital sovereignty isn't really something that's separate from all of the other processes around digital. So it's part of the conversation about, how does the EU support the AU in rolling out the AFCFTA, and within that the e-commerce protocol. It's part of the conversations around investments. Earlier on today, when they were talking about Global Gateway, a number of the panelists talked about, you know, the linkages with regulation and with, you know, protecting users' data. So it's part of all of these different processes. But it's also, I guess, within the D4D hub, there is also specifically the data flagship, which was discussed at length in the previous panel, which is also trying to specifically work on the question of how do we regulate data in Europe and in Africa, and then how do we build in the future a joint a joint vision when it comes to data regulation. And there, I think that there are efforts to start to build an inclusive conversation within Africa to support the African Union in further developing the African data flagship, the African data framework. But as was mentioned in that panel, you know, there's a need for a lot more conversations, because this is something that I believe GIZ in particular has been supporting the African Union in developing this, but it's something that that needs to be an ongoing process, and that will require a lot more work at the level of individual states across Africa, because having a top-down vision is useful, but in terms of the actual work of implementation, that will take place at the level of member states, and even more so in Africa, where processes are very much intergovernmental, and where the African Union Commission doesn't have quite the same role as the European Commission, which does drive legislation forward. It will be important that there is that these processes actually begin at the national level, and then, you know, and that are bottom up as well as being top down, if that makes sense.
Yes, thank you, Chloe. And I think that last point was a critical one. I mean, we can see that in other legislation on the continents, the protocols of free trade and movement, which had a top-down perspective, but are still struggling, you know, to be adopted nationally. So I think it's a very significant difference, and something that also should be considered. So with our last 4 minutes, we want to take one last question, and this is from Okello, who says that there are a lot of social innovations transforming service delivery in African countries, and the EU can be a strong ally in investing and scaling these solutions, but our governments have been slow. So how do we sort of centralize government, sort of bring them on to look at some of these civic social innovations from civic actors as a good thing, as allies as opposed to threats? Any thoughts on that? And this can be either from, well, this is mostly from the African government perspective. Unfortunately, we don't have an African government represented, but we could also learn some lessons from the EU approach. Have any of you seen examples of where a government has actually come behind social innovators to sort of support them and compete against them, for instance?
If I may try and probably not, you know, speaking directly to what governments need to do, but going also back to the Team Europe approach, where you also have corporate and tech role players, people that are actively doing business on the continent, and maybe there is also a need to focus what they are doing. I mean, I'm thinking, for example, in South Africa, you've got the largest company, which is a multimedia company called Naspers, investing in a number of startups across the country and also elsewhere in the continent. One also maybe need to look at continental communications giants like MTN, asking sort of what are they doing in terms of also nurturing that, and not only look to governments, particularly now in the context also where the balance sheets of many of our governments on the continent do not look favorable to do that kind of work.
That's a great point. I think that not just the governments, of course, we would hope that governments would see the opportunities from these innovators, but also we need to encourage private sector to also step in and support this. So we have 1 minute remaining, and with that, I just want to say a very big thank you to all of our panelists. Apologies if we didn't get to all of the questions, but I think we had a very engaging discussion. We looked at a number of different points, from investment to working together, our process, to opportunities in research, and also, you know, supporting each other as stakeholders, be it through advocacy in civil society, and private sector. There are a lot of takeaways that we will be sort of summarizing and hopefully sending back out to everyone. I just wanted to say a big thank you again to our panelists. We appreciate you. We thank you for your thoughts. And to our audience, we look forward to speaking with you or talking to you in another panel shortly. Thank you, everyone. We wish you a great day.